Hi, welcome to what we are calling Classic Bookmark. When we started shooting these interviews in the spring of 1988, we had no idea the show would go on for 30 years, with over 400 episodes. To celebrate and mark this achievement, we have selected 15 shows. Choosing was difficult. Most of the writers chosen, like Horton Foote and Ray Bradbury, are deceased. Others, like Toni Morrison, the Nobel Prize winner, are perfectly well, but I do not think we will be lucky enough to have them on the show again. We purposely did not include some bookmark favorites like Rick Bragg, Winston Groom, Sina Jeter Naslund, Brad Watson, Daniel Wallace, Michelle Richmond, and others, since we plan to visit with them regularly in the future. Viewers will notice that the technology has improved considerably in 30 years. We have cleaned these up the best we could. These first 30 years have been a lot of fun. I hope you enjoy watching these as much as I did making them. If you're a faithful viewer of Bookmark, you've seen interviews with Pulitzer Prize winners and National Book Award winners. But in 1993, Toni Morrison joined the most prestigious club of all, a club that includes Faulkner, Hemingway, and Saul Bellow. Miss Morrison was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. But you don't have to be an academic to read her books. Jazz impressed the Swedish Academy, but Song of Solomon was recommended by Oprah. While many of her novels take place in New York or Ohio, the characters, like Miss Morrison herself, have roots in the South.
My parents were both Southerners, right. And even though they'd come when they were children, I learned quite quickly the first time I left Ohio to go south. What was south for me? Washington, D.C., and then later a lot of places in the South, that the culture was seamless. And I felt comfortable in both parts of the country.
That's right. Your father's family was originally from Georgia.
Yes.
And people wanted to know your mother's family was originally from Alabama.
That's right.
Do you know where in Alabama?
Greenville. Greenville, Alabama.
And she went to Lorraine as a child.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
After you had gone through high school and the normal childhood experiences, I presume, in Ohio, you are an educated writer. You are not Robert Burns coming out of nowhere. You attended Howard and then Cornell.
Yes.
The single thing about your education that caught my eye was that your master's thesis is, keep me up on this, suicide in Faulkner and Virginia Woolf.
Yes. That was in the 50s.
Yeah.
American literature was, people may not know it now, but it was a discipline that had to fight its way into the academy like every discipline does. And I had an extraordinary advisor, Robert Elias at Cornell. And those books were, part of our reading matter. And I was searching around for a topic. And there was something interesting about suicide because, this is when everybody was sort of reading Kierkegaard and being sort of very theatrical and dramatic
right.
about the end of the world and the death of God. So that suicide had been elevated in the intellectual discourse to a very positive act in some quarters.
Right.
And it was interesting to see how that was true in a manner speaking for Virginia Woolf. But definitely it was a defeat and a collapse in the work of William Faulkner.
But when people notice, when they see what looks like stream of consciousness technique, and when they see what looks like sometimes very demanding narrative structures, is it fair to say that a lot of that goes back to a love that you had for those high modernists?
I guess so. I keep denying it on a regular basis because I'm so interested in, developing a voice that's peculiarly mine. But you can't really deny your own education. Many of those books were, in themselves, real education for me. And while you're struggling to get your own fingerprint, so to speak, who knows what affects you?
Sure. And I, believe me, I don't think that your voice is to be confused with Virginia Woolf's or William Faulkner, but just certain kinds of techniques. But
there was a lovely feeling of narrative, oral authority in William Faulkner that I associated with African American culture, which he associated with with the Southern culture, and I think both of us are right, since the interchange between the two is very much, is quite intimate.
After this considerable literary education, there was a period of time where you worked as a book editor, and you're for Random House mostly?
Yes, exclusively.
Exclusively. I have two questions I'd like you to kind of talk about in terms of book editing. One is, did it give you the opportunity to promote a number of writers that you thought ought to get more attention, ought to be in print?
That was the excitement about being an editor. First I worked in textbooks, and then in a very short time I was in trade publishing. And at that time, I guess this was 73 or 2 or something, there was a lot of ferment in the country, and the agents, the people I was supposed to court, didn't really have the books I was interested in publishing. So I had to scare up emerging writers, women, black writers, black women, black men, telling an alternate story. And they weren't always commercially successful because you had to build a new readership. But I knew that there was a readership out there, and they were kind enough, courageous enough to take on some of these early writers who have now become, sort of household words. You see some of them.
Which words?
Well,
who are they?
Gail Jones,
Right.
who is well known and is an extraordinary fiction writer. Toni Bambara, whose posthumous novel I have worked on for the whole of the summer and is being published now. It's called Those Bones Are Not My Child. It's a story of the Atlanta children murders in the 80s. I worked with Angela Davis on all her books. I did Muhammad Ali's autobiography, which was hardly an emerging writer, but certainly, it was very exciting to me. I published Lucille Clifton's only narrative. She's a poet, but she wrote this one wonderful narrative. I had a good time. I had a splendid time finding these writers, or having them call me and our working together.
Well, these writers that you helped to emerge have stayed emerged.
Oh, yes. Oh, and I had no question about their permanence. It was just, trying to get that first book on and have it reviewed, responded to, and read. And they've become, standards in American literature, certainly African American literature.
Well, being an editor then gave you an opportunity to promote other people's work. But the other half of my question, or the second question, is how did it affect the possibilities for your own work? Now, some people think that the job to have is sort of, work in a factory or work in a coal mine and not use your, in a sense, your literary brain all day. And other people think, no, that makes you tired. How did your first novel was written while you were a full-time working editor?
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
How did you do it?
Well, I was a teacher for a long time before I went into publishing. And I know how to separate my own creative energies and interests from those of students. There's no conflict there. But what I would try to do with students is to get them to do the very best work that's possible for them. Right. So I had that sort of distance, and also an ability to read. That is, to read my own work in a critical way, as well as to read other people's. It was less of a vested interest there. But the actual signing up of the book and getting it published was very hard. Publishing did not make it easy for me because I was hired to acquire books, not to publish them myself. So for a long time, I never told anybody I was writing The Bluest Eye, ever, in the publishing house. And then once I had sold it, there was a close friend of mine to whom I shared that information. But I thought they would be mad at me, and they were. I mean, not mad, they were sort of suspicious, because editor is a very clear, almost anonymous kind of job then. You know, they were not like conductors and producers. They were not assertive publicly. So that was problematic, and I was very apologetic, sort of, in the company, you know, lounge, so to speak, about it. But once that happened, and it had happened once before that I know of, where a literary editor had become a literary writer, and that was Ed Doctorow.
Right.
So there was some precedent there, but usually they'd quit. But I just didn't have the resources to quit. I had to work a lot because I had 2 children.
And you went through 2 novels as an editor before
Yes.
you did move on.
Yes, yes.
When you moved on, you did some teaching of creative writing, and you had taught literature and composition and so on prior to being an editor, but then after The Bluest Eye and Sula.
It was really after Sula, you're right. And while Song of Solomon was in process, I taught at Yale for 3 semesters, and I taught a course on contemporary black women's fiction, which was sort of, you know, I had like 4 books, but I thought it was an important course to teach. And at the same time, I was, you know, going along with the editing process. The distinctions were not always clear, but in a way it was very coherent. I've always either read books or taught books or written books or edited them. And creative writing, I mean, I never heard of it before. It didn't exist.
But you did it.
But I did, and I used skill as an editor. You know, when I got the manuscript, I would do what an editor does.
I'm fond of asking, well, excuse me. I'm fond of asking writers who have taught writing, after they're done with it, and you're pretty well done with it now, does it work? Did you feel that that writing, you were not taught in workshop, and yet you held workshops at SUNY Albany and at Princeton?
Right.
How did it go? How did you feel about it? Did you think that it was working?
It worked for the people for whom it could work. It didn't work for the pedestrian, merely dogged student. You cannot teach that. Vision, truth, beauty, I mean, those things. For those who had talent, you could help them identify it. What was interesting to me is that for students, if they have any talent at all, they usually don't respect it if it's easy. It's only when it's hard. And they don't know what to trust in their writing. They think if they're blowing it up and making it bigger and more elaborate, that it's better than the things that are natural to them. So I can teach a certain kind of respect and encourage them to feel where their strengths are. But more importantly, what one does, I take their manuscripts and we go over it word for word. Word for word for word, line by line by line. And they learn the most important thing, which I think every writer knows about, but many students don't, and they hate it, which is how to revise. That, you know, you do it again. Well, some things you don't, but that process of revision, if you don't like that process, then you should get out of the shop, because that is so much of what it is. So that I can teach.
You did what an old-fashioned, hard-working editor used to do.
Yes.
But they don't do it much anymore.
They don't do it at all.
They don't do it at all. Does that affect the American literature as we now know it?
Absolutely. I think that there are writers of profound talent who have been profoundly misled by the absence of really good line editors anymore. I think it's a big disservice. Lots of writers, of course, don't appreciate that act of editing. There are countries in which it's unheard of, the kinds of things that one does in American publishing houses. But the great line editors of the legendary history of publishing just stand out. Now that work is given to what are known as copy editors or freelance editors. And I, as an editor at Random House, by the time I quit, even then, promotions and encouragement and status was given to the larger acquisitions, not the detailed work. Not that, not, and things that one loves, like choosing paper and font and jackets and covers, which is, for me, exciting. It's all of the book work, was increasingly, and I think economically speaking, probably better to compartmentalize like that. But it left my role, I think, or any editor's role, diminished in the things that one loved, and enhanced or grown in the areas that were less interesting to me. Contracts, negotiations, having lunch. I mean,
Are we going to be the last generation that is in love with the book as object?
no.
The book as object is going to endure? It's not all going to be
No.
computer screens?
No, some of it will be, and I don't even object to that. I've seen some of those so-called rocket books, and they're very friendly to handle. And yes, you can read them real fast, punch a button, I guess. And it's good for, I read a lot of airplane stuff, and I don't want to have those books in my library at all. I just want to read them and throw them away.
Right.
And those are perfect for that.
So no trees will get cut down to read the books, to make
right.
the books that you don't want to keep anyway.
Yeah, but the books you want to read over,
Mm-hmm.
the books you love, I mean, I'm not going to read that on the screen at all. And I think what will develop would be people who love books, making books, and I think they'll still be sold in large numbers. I really do.
Well, your books will.
Well, thank you.
Let's talk about your books for a
Sure.
while. Different things. People, and believe me, in the last few days, when it became rumored that you would be here and that I would get an opportunity to talk with you, I can't tell you how many people have asked me to ask you certain kinds of
yes.
questions. When you sit down, ask this.
Mm-hmm.
And a question, a naive but perhaps evocative question is, those books are very difficult. Do they have to be so difficult as that? Why can't you tell a story at the beginning and move it through to the end? But I know you have aims and strategies there. What are you doing?
It's boring just to say A, B, C, D, E, F, G. The process of reading ought to be like the process of living a life, in a life of the imagination. Discovery, pulling things together from the past, from the present. I like the real engagement. There are lots of readers that don't want to do that. And also they're used to skimming, like this.
Well, they can't.
And I don't want to skim myself with really interesting books. I want it to be a book that even I might want to read 5 or 6 years later. Mm-hmm. Certainly the readers who are demanding will. If you read one of those books when you're 18 and another time when you're 38, it's an entirely different book. I mean, I've had that experience over and over again. Sure. So that's one of the reasons. And the other is, I don't think they're difficult at all. I mean, Ulysses is difficult.
Yes. And it is chronological.
Yes, but I mean, that's play. That's a deliberate effort to demand everything and more. And by the time you get to Finnegan's Wake, I mean, you're in deep trouble if you can't.
Right.
The level of difficulty for me, I don't think it's true that those books are difficult at all.
All right. Since you say so.
Difficulty just means you have to read every word.
Yes.
So?
Twice. From beginning to end and then again. Well, complexity is one thing, but you have narrative strategies. You have things that are working here. And one of the things must be the notion that the truth, in absolute terms with a capital T, is not available.
No, it's not. And if it is, I wouldn't trust it anyway. There are layers to life. There are layers to what we think. I'm excited to be here in Birmingham about this conference on storytelling because the way in which we put our lives together, the way in which our family tells its own stories, the reasons for that, and the distortions, because they lie all the time. And there's a reason for that. And the nation puts itself together a certain way. This cognitive process of constructing narrative about life is a major way in which we, know things, are centralized in our family, in our communities, and so on. And they're not straightforward. I mean, some of them may appear to be, but there are all sorts of gaps in there, all sorts of turns, all sorts of debates with other members saying, no, that was not it. The color of the story changes from one generation to another. I mean, this is, what the imaginative and the conscious and the historical mind does. So this is not entertainment for me. And I mean, writing fiction and reading fiction is very serious and very profound business. And it does have layers of meaning. It does have ambivalence, ambiguity. It has triumph. It has some sadness. But always, always, you see these people inventing themselves and reinventing themselves and getting rid of the history that is useless to them, if they are healthy and if they can, or being crushed by it. Just keep repeating the same story over and over again and expecting a different outcome, even though you're doing the same things.
Well, that's in the nature of complexity. But a word that appeared, that you spoke a moment ago, ambiguity, is a little different from complexity. The narratives are complex, and the story may be told from 8 points of view, and it may be challenging for the reader to get it straight. But that's different from not really knowing exactly what happened.
Yeah, withholding. I do withhold.
Yes. The last scene of Song of Solomon, for example, a book that I've read several times and taught many times, and I don't know what happens on the last page. Especially, I don't know what happens on the page following the last page. That is, does Milkman kill Guitar? Does Guitar kill Milkman? Can either one of them fly? Would you mind straightening me out on this?
Sure. I'll tell you what I think.
Okay.
But I think before I tell you that, I should tell you, I really don't want it to close like a television show. It's over and on to the next show.
Okay.
I want it haunting. I want the resonance there, the echo, the taste. And also I want to make the point, and the point in that book is it doesn't really matter about the milkman's life's length, because the quality of his life is so much improved. He's a person now. He can love other people. He can give it up. I mean, that's what he can do, and that is metaphorically flying, when you are your own person. And in my mind, they simply fight. They just fight, and nobody dies. But he's willing to die. He's willing to give it up for a principle.
And the quantity, length of his life wouldn't really be the point.
It isn't the point.
Because he's discovered who he is.
He is, yeah.
Right. And that
seems to me to be articulate. Now, I know that it would be, I certainly can say that, what I just said to you, in some narrative, figurative language. And I would say, but I want the reader to get in there, to work with me on this, and have some different ideas. If you think that Guitar wins and blows this kid away, that's because that's part of your fear or your yearning. If you think that Milkman kills him, which is unlikely, but if you think so, that's another part of the reader's hunger for that kind of solution. I was raised on stories that had ambiguous endings, where we could change the ending if we wanted to. As kids, my parents would ask us to tell stories, or they would ask questions. But there was always this world beyond the story that was a free place for us to come in and use our imaginations too. It wasn't this totalitarian dictatorial. Here it is. That's the meaning of this, you know. And besides, mythology itself is not like that.
Right. So your writing is not merely not a riddle,
No.
a complex riddle to be solved. It's a text to be engaged with by the reader's active imagination.
Exactly.
And that's...
Exactly.
do you... I know you have a lot of readers. Do you have the feeling that you have a lot of readers who are the kind of readers that you want them to be?
They're becoming the kinds of readers I want them to be. Yeah. I get fewer people who slam the book up against the wall and more people who tell me, because I've been out here for a while now,
right,
who tell me, as a matter of fact, I had a friend, a reader, a few years ago who said, when I first opened The Bluest Eye, I said, and put it down. And then a couple of years later, read it and found in it some things. Went on to read some other books. She's just between 18 and 32 that this is happening for her. And what she came to be, what she became, was not just a reader of my work, which she did, because she moved to a place where it was not the difficult, this is not going to be a happy story, I don't want to read it if it's not going to make me feel good, kind of thing. And now she reads everything like that. So I don't care whether she started with me or William Faulkner or Doctorow or Virginia Woolf, anyone. The point is, at some point, when you get that hook, then you're pulled in, then all of your reading becomes nuanced if you're reading work that has nuance.
Our conversation with Toni Morrison covered a wide range of subjects. It continues next week. I hope you'll join us. In this program, we continue our conversation with Nobel laureate Toni Morrison. She's the author of Jazz, Song of Solomon, Beloved, and several other novels. One of her concerns is the responsibility of the artist, especially the black female artist, to her immediate community.
For me, that is the dilemma. The desire to be one's own self, with one, unlike anything else in the world, you are you. And at the same time, you want to belong to something that's bigger than oneself, and we all do. And the tension between those two is powerful. It's especially interesting in African American communities because the community has always been the protection. Being alone and an African American in so many places, in so many parts of history, was like being dead. You needed the community for protection. And also, it held your history that was a buried or silenced or unspoken history in the mainstream. So it was absolutely the lifeblood of the individual. And of course, it reflects African communities in which the individual is not as important as the community. Bringing those over into this country, where, as you say, individual freedom is the principle upon which the country is founded, one of them, this, creates an incredible amount of fierce confrontation, self-doubt, all sorts of things that a novelist would be excited about. So it isn't about, I have to talk about what is important in the novel, which is the community, which succored those people, was indeed their strength. But at the same time, those communities have enormous demands on one's behavior, on one's values, and they do not brook much dispute. And how do you become an individual, an artist, sort of James Joyce, artist as a young, portrait of, under those circumstances? That's the struggle, and that's the struggle that interests me. And in some cases, when you have a book like Sula, it's just impossible for her. Other things are impossible for her, but she is understood to be a witch. Now, of course, if you put it in the realm of women, you're in bigger trouble, because women are understood to be nurturers, mothers, bearers of the community, of the culture. These are the women who have the memory, who transmit it, etc. And to have a woman try to be independent and an individual is almost like a contradiction in terms.
And an artist.
And an artist at the same time. I mean, that is the battle. So it isn't that I, as the speaker may have suggested at all, that I, diminish the individual for the community. I'm just interested in the struggle. Mm-hmm. And some of the individuals turn out to, be successful and go on. And Tar Baby, Jadine split. She went off to do what she was doing. He, however, joined this mythological world of males who were romantically, powerfully, ghostly mm-hmm. on the island. They knew what to do as human beings, but one was totally, or at least he romanticized, I'm not sure he was actually really totally involved, but he romanticized his roots and his family, although he was a drifter, although he was always by himself. He still had that idea of the healthy, wonderful, helpful, nurturing community in his mind. She didn't have any of that. So that makes for the problem. But it is that's precisely that is the argument that I want to advance.
Right. The relationship of the individual and the community, that's the tension in a lot of work. Something a little bit narrower than any individual in the community, or even the artist in the community, that I see sometimes in your work and in others, which I'll mention. I thought, for example, that Macon Dead Sr., I guess Milkman's father, I guess he's Macon Dead Jr., actually, isn't he? All right. He reminded me of Dr. Bledsoe, the college president in Invisible Man, in a very particular way. He was a black businessman, professional, obviously Macon Dead, a businessman, Bledsoe, college president, but a person who was successful, and in the case of Macon Dead, a landlord, and not particularly gracious to his black tenants, or not forgiving, wanted the rent, very capitalist. And the question that arose there, it arises a lot of different places, is what is the responsibility of black individuals, entrepreneurs, upper middle class people? He was roundly loathed by a lot of the black community. He
was a slumlord.
He was, of course he was. How does that, what's the tension there as you see it?
Well, he was, had some reasons for being the way he was, very unlike his sister who she's earth, he's property. She didn't want anything, he wants everything. So those were the two diametrically opposed streams of what happens to any community, I suppose, and what the possibilities are if you are going to be a businessman. Do you have to lose your moral compass when you're a businessman? Obviously not. My own personal experience is that men such as Macon Dead were known as what we used to call race men. They were the doctors and the lawyers and the businessmen who had put themselves forward. They were the black middle class, and they spent a lot of time, if not all the time, making sure that black people less fortunate than they were could go to the movie houses that may have been segregated, could go to the swimming pools. I mean, they made that way possible for those. It was always lifting as we climb. It was always that. So I didn't feel the tension, the class tension that is represented in Song of Solomon as a child, because their responsibility was so clear. Whether they were mean landlords or nice landlords, they seldom permitted anyone to abuse people simply because they were poor. Now comes integration and the benefits of being able to live in more places than segregated neighborhoods and go to schools other than is a big benefit for African Americans. But it's also, you pay a price for that. You all don't go to the same barbershop or the same hairdresser or even the same church. So that moving out assimilation process, which every group has experienced in this country. It's the same thing for African Americans. So you have people who are obscenely wealthy and obscenely powerful. Oh, well, I guess they wouldn't say obscenely powerful, but among African Americans who are real movers and shakers. Now, what is their job?
What is their responsibility?
What is their responsibility? Some of them make a way. I mean, there are people who are filmmakers who demand that the people behind the cameras are African Americans, and they're searching desperately for African American scripts, and and they do that. And there are others who'd say, "It's not my job." So you won the range, and the point is that that fight, that struggle, that coming to terms with responsibility versus, the rewards of the independent acquisition thinker or capitalist, is an American situation. The point is that at least here you can move up and down in one generation, and that's almost impossible anyplace else in the world.
The fiction by African Americans over the last, say, 50 years, it seems to me there's been an evolution. Well, say more than 50, say 70. Go back as far as Richard
20s,
Wright
yeah.
in the 20s and 30s. And that an awful lot of fiction, as Richard Wright wanted it to be, and as he did himself, had to do with race in the sense that it was social protest literature, or it was literature about the after effects of slavery and about the relationship between whites and blacks. What I've seen lately, some in jazz, for example, especially, and in something like The Color Purple, Alice Walker's probably best known book at this point, is that there are books that don't have any white people in them to speak of. That they're by black writers, and they're about the black community. Is it? Do you think, first of all, that is an observation that holds some kind of water?
I think it's quite accurate.
And is it an evolutionary stage that we should welcome?
Oh, I think so.
How do you?
Well, a couple of things about that. My own position was, in the books written by Richard Wright and some of the great African American writers, I thought they were talking to somebody else. You probably.
To whom?
You.
Yes, sure.
Which they should have done. I mean, there was nothing wrong with that. It was just, it sort of went by me like somebody's talking over my shoulder, because that confrontation, which is male and racial and social, and is about justice and the human heart, is not only legitimate, it is essential to their work. But when I began to write, I was interested in another part of the canvas, which was primarily female, and also it was within. What you have noticed is accurate, I think, primarily among African American women writers. In this way, I think, generally speaking. You see me backing off of this.
Okay. This is not science.
But it sounds right to me. White men write about white men. Black men write about black men and white men, because that, for them, like the books we just described, is the major central argument of their social and personal existence, is this domination or being dominated by. White women write about white men because those are their fathers, their brothers, their lovers, their sons. I mean, they should. And it just seemed to me that black women, African American women, don't write about white men. Now, the other thing is, I just was not interested in that confrontation. I don't mean as a human being, but I mean in the work. And when I began to think about even the first book, I mean, there's some white people in it, but they're sort of minor, it just opened up the world to me. If I didn't have to talk about that, then I had like this huge, huge canvas that was available to me. The other just pulled, the story would always be about the same thing.
Right.
And I was.
Well, I think it's a fantastic advantage for you.
It is.
Not to be concerned about
That's right.
that issue anymore.
That's right.
Because it opens up the possibilities of so many
Right.
others.
And also, the address was to the characters in the book. I mean, I always say, well, the people who don't read the book were probably the people I wanted to feel most like they could. And if I were going to talk to Pilate or to Seth or to any of those people and say, well, is this like it? They're the ones who have to say yes. They don't want to hear about all this other stuff. Is this the way it was for you? Is this like what it must have been like for you? Did I do it right? And I'm talking to the people in the book. They are the readers, even though they are not. I mean, you know, but that's the way I feel about it. And this is their story. Men and women, young and old. It's not. And I also think that when you're very culturally specific in your narrative, then you become truly accessible to everybody outside the culture. It doesn't work the other way around. If you try to write the big, sort of watered down, one world, everybody's book, then it just is nothing. But you know, if you're a Russian and you're writing about Russians and your name is Chekhov and you know, that's when it becomes everybody's literature.
The specific is what leads to the universal.
Exactly.
The subject of your books, in a way, if one were being particularly glib, is love. All kinds of love. Some of it very painful. People interpret your works as varieties of effects of people's passion for one another. Does that seem fair to you?
Oh,
Is that
yeah.
how you think of them?
I think
Setha and her child. Who's the man in jazz who shoots?
Joe Trace,
Yes, who
and Violet.
shoots his girlfriend.
Dorcas, yeah.
Lo-
Well, it's our human invention, you know, love.
How are we doing at it?
We've reduced it to just one kind of love, or maybe two. But there's less and less to love. Lots and lots to feel sensational about, but we're narrowing down what there is to love. And
I'm not sure I understand. I'd love to hear you expand on that a
well, you
little.
know, we used to be able to love God, country, mother, father,
Thy
lover,
neighbor?
or thy neighbor. You know, there were lots of things. Now, if you love God too much, people think you're a little strange in a very secular society in which we live.
Sure,
I
fair
mean,
enough.
love in the way that the martyrs used to love, love in the way that St. Augustine used to love. If you love your parents a lot, Freud has made that a sort of impossible deficiency. If you love your country the way Chanson de Roland, I mean, you know, that way, you're a mercenary sort of.
Well, you look like Oliver North.
Exactly. You know, you sort of, what is that about? You know, besides, what is the country? What is the nation state? Well, we're all global. What does it mean? And you just look terrible and sort of unintellectual and deficient in some way.
This is much clearer.
You see what I'm saying?
Yes,
so
I
about
do.
the extreme love. So what's left, really, are just two kinds of love that our society has said okay. And one is the love of man and woman, or romantic love. And the other is love of your children. But that's complicated because you can love them too much, and then you become oppressive, and or you can neglect them. If you discipline them, people might arrest you for being an abusive parent. So it gets very. So the only thing that's left is this consensual sexual love, and it can't stand it. It can't bear it. Marriages fall apart, relationships fall apart, because the other person has to be everything. The father, the mother, the child, the house, the nation, the God, and no one person can deliver all of that, or should be required to carry that burden. And you just want to say, I want to say to some of these people, don't you have anything else you can love besides just this one person? There must be 5 or 6 other things that you can feel deeply passionate about. So for me, it was just the consequences of being human operate in that area, in love.
The consequences of romantic loss in jazz are a shooting that leads to a death.
Yes.
The consequences of a kind of mother love in Beloved
Yes.
is the death of the infant.
Yes. Well, how can I make you get your attention?
Oh, you had it. You had
About these
everyone's
things.
attention. Yes, right.
Unless I show you what can go wrong with excesses. What can go wrong if you are Joe Trace? He didn't know what he loved. I mean, half of it's his mother, half of it's Violet, half of it's this, and he's going after this girl, and she, of course, is complicit. She has this little 18-year-old romantic notion. And that was a period in which romantic love was very much on the minds of African Americans, in the music, everywhere. I mean, it was like, ooh, now we can love anybody we want. You know, it's a choice, it was freedom. And for Sethe, of course, it's entirely different. She's forbidden to love her children by law. She's forbidden to be responsible for her children by law. So she claims that love savagely and ravages that love. I mean, it's who she is. And the same thing in Paradise, when you have people who have this rather spectacular history of courage, and they believe God has shown them the way. So you have this quarrel between the Old and the New Testament, and you have people who love what they have become, couched in the words of their religion, more than anything else.
So that's, in a sense, that's
It's
religious love gone
Absolutely.
astray,
Right.
as Sethe might be mother love gone astray,
Exactly.
or as Joe might be romantic love gone
All
astray.
gone astray. This is not a statement about how I feel about love. This is a book.
Yes.
And the book is supposed to interrogate
Yes.
these things and interrogate these passions that are deep, almost in the Greek classical sense, too much. No, nobody's on an even keel here, you know, no restraint. They step over the line. When you step over the line, sometimes bad things happen.
When you were a college student, you were, in fact, a classics major or minor.
Minor.
You read Latin, I
Yes.
know. Did you read Greek?
No.
No?
Never learned to read. All
Well,
in
not very many
translation.
people do. I have another question somewhere along these same lines, that is, in terms of the evolution of African American fiction recently. There are writers who think that African Americans always have been, from the Middle Passage, cut off from their roots. And then there are writers who think that the past is recoverable, findable, and for an artist, usable. I think of you in that second group, the group of writers who thinks that there hasn't been an absolute severing, that the past is just as available for African Americans as it is for anyone else. Do you think
I think
that's
so.
how you feel about
That's
that?
how I feel about it. I think it's artists who look that way. Even the act of cutting off the roots is itself a comment on the past, that you haven't been able to pull from it that which is fruitful and useful, that you think the whole of it is corrupt and shameful. It's like if you were an individual and you woke up one day and you couldn't remember anything before you were 30. It was all a blank. I think you would be lesser for that, even though the first 29 years may have been very painful. I think going there and finding out what that was and being able to transform it creatively and constructively enhances your life, your presence, your imagination. So I think it's a healthy thing to do, although it is a scary thing to do, to really look at it.
There are writers, as much as any writer might dream of winning the Nobel Prize, there have always been writers who feared it as well. that life would never be the same. There would be no privacy, that every word would be scrutinized. What would I ever do? What would I ever write or publish after winning the prize that anybody would ever like again? How's life been since Stockholm?
Oh, it's been pretty good. Kurt Vonnegut said, winning the Nobel Prize means you die.
Yeah. Well, not so far.
I said, I don't know, I guess it has a burden quality to it, a kind of, oh my God, now what do I do quality. But you know, I thought it was thrilling. I mean, utterly.
Yes.
And it was so satisfying. And also, I didn't worry about, oh, well, what are they going to say? Because I have, this may sound a little arrogant, I have the highest criteria in the world for myself. Nobody's criteria is higher than mine. Now, sometimes it may not, people may not understand what those obstacles and those leaps are, or what I think I'm doing, how careful I am, how intricate, you know, and what's going on. But that's the risk you take if you write. You just write, there it is, and some people get it, some people don't. And maybe you're wrong, and maybe you don't make it yourself. But that's, I have to have a career. That is, I want to write more and better, and more and better. I want to do that, with or without that prize. So I have to, I'm lucky because I didn't get anybody's attention until I was well into my 30s.
Yes.
So I didn't have like a young life of publicity. I was an already kind of formed person.
Celebrity for young writers is very dangerous.
It can be. It can be very dangerous. So I always took it with, you know, not with a grain of salt, but I understood what it was. And having worked in publishing, you know, I was deeply unimpressed with, you know, I know what it is. So I didn't come to it in a vulnerable state. I wanted to employ it. I wanted to go and get honorary degrees when they were offered to me, so that young black women in that school could see it. That's all. It didn't have anything to do with all those hoods on my wall. It's that people could see it. I wanted a large readership because I wanted those young girls like me who never saw those people to see it and say, me too, or I like it, or well, you know. Yeah. So that's what the celebrity is for me. You know, my dream is to stay home and not go anywhere. But that's I feel really responsible, not only to never to talk down to anybody in my books, never try to get away with, but at the same time to have, since I already have a public life, it has to work for some reason.